So the thing that we want to make sure that we understand is that product market versus factor market are two big differences. And on Friday, we did the circular flow to remind about product versus factor markets. And so today we want to revisit it. A product market is when we're buying and selling stuff. And let's graph what a product market looks like. A perfectly competitive product market, as a matter of fact. So a perfectly competitive product market, we draw as a side-by-side. There's supply and demand, quantity. Here's our price of the market. And let's just say this is like the Nintendo. Here's the quantity of the market. And then what we did is we dotted across, and then over here we have our favorite line, Mr. DARP. Hopefully you remember what all these acronyms mean. And then we drew through our marginal cost, which equals supply. Since this is supply and demand, this here is equilibrium. And then remember, the label P1 had to be the same label here. And in the end, then, we have a couple of visuals that we need to see. Notice that our x-axes are on the same plane. Our equilibriums are on the same plane. Some students, when they were turning stuff in, were doing something like this. This is not the way you want to draw. You want to make sure you're drawing on the same plane. It would need to be across like so. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be close. As close as you can make it without making it ugly. So over here then we have to add our quantity line, and then finally what we see is the quantity for the market and the quantity for the firm are going to be differently labeled, but the price and the points will be on the same line. This is what we call a perfectly competitive side-by-side in long run equilibrium. Does anybody have any questions on that one? That is from a while back, and it is expected that you are familiar with this on the AP exam. You will most likely have to draw this, shift it, interpret it, and then draw it again. So the factor market is called the factor market because the factors are our resources. You could also call this a resource market instead of a factor market. Remember, our resources are sell. Hopefully you can see that at the top of the board. It looks like you can in the shadow there. And then in order to draw a factor market, it's also a side-by-side. And so the reason I drew this first is because I want you to be able to see the differences between a perfectly competitive side-by-side in a product market versus a perfectly competitive side-by-side in a factor market. So the market that we're going to start with is going to be labor. And so remember, this title is always going to be one of these four, either capital, entrepreneurship, land, or labor. Because this is a factor market, it's the only things that this could be. Over here, it could be literally anything that you want it to be. And I chose Nintendo because Nintendo started a revolution. It really did. It changed the world of the video game industry. So labor then, supply and demand. And what we have here is a perfectly competitive labor market that I'm going to label with a W there because this stands for wage because we pay labor wages. And this is the quantity of the market. Notice the graph looks exactly the same. A couple fundamental differences to remember is that this is the supply of labor and this is the demand for labor. What that means is that this over here, supply meant the business. Over here, demand means the business because businesses hire the labor. Over here, then, demand meant the people. And over here, supply is the people because we are the ones that are labor that go out and do the work. It's a big difference. This is the big difference. It's about philosophy. So here are producers, here are consumers. Over here, the consumers are now the businesses. That's why you call it a monopsony with one buyer, because the business is the one buyer of labor. And then the people are the supplier. From here, then, guess what? We do something very similar. Dot across, and then over this, then right there has to be labeled the same. Because what this means is that all firms in this perfectly competitive labor market are what we call wage takers. You might remember over here, firms were called what we call price takers. Firms over here are called wage takers because they have to pay the market wage. It's just the way it is because the people will quit and go somewhere else. If it's a perfectly competitive labor market, people will rotate jobs all the time. Now here's the big difference. This line is your supply curve, and this line equals something called the MFC. Over here was the demand curve. Here it's the supply curve. That is the fundamental difference. Now MFC could also be MRC, and let's talk about what these stand for. MFC stands for marginal, F is factor, of course, and C is cost. So let's talk about what these words mean in economics. Marginal means additional, factor means resource, and cost is what a business pays. So marginal, factor, cost is what the business pays for an additional resource. MRC is the same thing. It stands for marginal resource cost. And so, ladies and gentlemen, MRC and MFC are the exact same thing. I've seen the AP exam use both. Different textbooks use both. I think in the modern time, MFC is the most common. So you use that, you're going to be gold. To finish this out, then we have to add our demand curve. The demand curve equals MRP. The MRP stands for marginal revenue product. And to quickly review what these words mean, marginal means additional, revenue means money, and actually means sales, money from sales, and product means stuff. And so marginal revenue product means the additional money we get from selling stuff. And then ultimately, this intersect right here is supply and demand. So this quantity line is the number of workers that the firm will hire in long run equilibrium. When we are working in this on the AP exam, the key question always will be, how many workers will the firm hire to maximize profit? And that'll be the next phase of what we learn to do. You might recall over here, the question was a little bit more simple. It was how much should we produce in order to maximize profit? Over here, the question is how many workers will we hire in order to maximize profit? And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is our overview to discuss the differences between factor markets and product markets. Anybody have any questions?